It is an absolute honor for me to be here to deliver this keynote speech at the conference of the Nigerian Bar Association. I consider myself to be standing before some of the greatest minds that this continent has ever produced. And I was amused while recently reading a social history of medicine in the United States, to come across the sentence that read, American medicine a century ago was for people considered too immoral for the pulpit and too stupid for the bar. But I'm sure the Nigerian Medical Association will have a few serious views on that sentence. But of course, the larger point is that I want to start by acknowledging the great regard in which the legal profession is held. And as a consequence, how apt the theme of this year's conference, Bold Transitions, is. In his address, the chair of the Technical Committee on Conference Planning, Tobinne Orejuwe, who, by the way, happens to have grown up on the campus of the University of Nigeria as I did. There was something in the water that we drank. Tobinna spoke of the disruptive transitions, such as technology and access to data, that continue to significantly change the way we live. I'm a writer, a lover of language, a lover of words. And I like to describe myself using a word that is the title of Robert McNeil's memoir, Wordstruck. And so I could not help but be struck by the word disruptive. Some words seem to capture particular zeitgeists, and this word disruptive seems to speak to the spirit of our age. Traditionally, disruptive has often been used in a negative sense. So we have many primary school teachers who have reprimanded students for being disruptive in class. Traditional synonyms for disruptive include troublesome, disorderly, unsettling, troublemaking. But today, disruptive has taken on a more positive and perhaps even a trendy connotation. It now tends to mean innovative and original, especially concerning technology and access to information. Troublesome and innovative. They might seem opposed to each other, but I would argue that these two understandings of disruptive can be applied to the Nigerian Bar Association. So, troublesome. Many people who have abused their positions of power in Nigeria would describe the Nigerian Bar Association as troublesome. To me, this is worthy of applause. Throughout history, those who have maintained principled positions and fought for justice have often been viewed as troublesome. Even the principal figures of Christianity and Islam were considered troublesome in their time. But a potential problem with the word troublesome is the assumption that the troublesome action is itself the point. The American journalist Adam Sewa wrote about many of the cruel policies of President Trump's government. And to the question, why would this administration be so cruel? His conclusion was, the cruelty is the point. But in this case, the disruption is not the point. The troublemaking is not the point. What matters is not that we are troublesome. What matters is why we are troublesome. The remarkably humane and resilient African-American civil rights leader, John Lewis, often spoke of the necessity of making good trouble, which I understand to mean not trouble for the sake of making trouble, but trouble to achieve a greater good, and in this case, justice. The Nigerian Bar Association was troublesome during Nigeria's years of military rule because of your long-standing tradition of fighting for human rights, fairness, and equity for the good of the Nigerian people. During the End SARS protests, the Nigerian Bar Association spoke out firmly about the illegal and immoral use of force and outlined clear steps to prevent its reoccurrence for the good of the Nigerian people. The vocal and wonderfully troublesome involvement of the Nigerian Bar Association in ensuring the passage of the Electoral Act and the principled but intense pressure brought to bear on the executive branch to assent to the bill was for the good of the Nigerian people. And I want to personally thank Mr. Olumide Akpata for his leadership. Because actions like these reverberate and inspire others and make us see that it matters that we take a stand. We are starved of heroes in this country. So many young people are hungry for figures that they can look up to, for examples of integrity. One of my Nigerian heroes is Dr. Dora Akunyili, the late, may she rest in peace, may she continue to rest in peace, the late former Director General of NAFDAC, who was also considered troublesome. Troublesome meant that she, among other things, fought the importation of fake drugs into Nigeria, that she tackled the substandard status quo of the food and drug industries, and by so doing, she saved and changed many Nigerian lives. The Nigerian legal profession is in a unique position to give us more heroes. Heroes are not angels. Heroes are not perfect human beings. Heroes are beautifully flawed. They believe in trying. They choose hope. They reject cynicism. Heroes understand that heroism is like yoga or like many other forms of physical training. Heroism is really about practice. Aristotle knew this when he wrote, "We become just by performing just acts, temperate by performing temperate acts, brave by performing brave acts." Gani Fawehinmi was a hero to so many and inspired a generation of Nigerians to want to become lawyers. But heroism does not have to be public or colorful. Every lawyer who acts to uphold the rule of law is a hero. Because the truth is that this country is in utter disarray. As Igbo people say, Ifa Marokolo, things are not standing well. Life is hard and getting harder for a vast majority of Nigerians. We must save the soul of our nation, and we cannot save the soul of our nation without the rule of law. We are blighted by insecurity all over this country. From Anambra State, my home state, where people are worried about holding traditional marriage ceremonies, to Kaduna State, where people are reluctant to be out on the roads. But insecurity is really a fundamental problem of the failure of the rule of law. It can sometimes seem hopeless. It can feel as though the Nigerian rot is too deep, and one can sometimes wonder why we should even bother to try to effect some positive change. But we know we can change things, no matter how small. We know that the beginning of a bold transition can sometimes take just one person. The digitization of law records in some parts of Nigeria, too few parts of Nigeria, have often been because of the decision of one person and has resulted in massive benefits for many people. The fact, for example, that all land registry issues are in a digital directory and precedents can easily be researched increases the possibility of delivering real justice, especially to those who are economically disadvantaged. And so, the fact that something is difficult or unlikely is not a reason not to try. As the Swiss poet Hermann Hesse wrote, so that the possible can come into being, the impossible has to be attempted again and again. A bold transition cannot begin with the premise of pessimism. It must embrace audacity, the audacity of being both troublesome and innovative. I have had the distinct pleasure of being called troublesome. And, and because sarcasm can often be lost in speeches of this sort, I think I should clarify that I use the word pleasure sarcastically. Because, of course, it is never enjoyable to be called troublesome or controversial or provocative. At least it isn't enjoyable to me. I have never set out to provoke for the sake of provoking, because not only do I think that it is quite a juvenile way of being in the world, but it isn't my nature. However, I refuse to silence myself for the fear that I might inadvertently provoke. What guides me in general is never the question, will this attract criticism? But rather, the question, is this true? Do I truly believe this? And will this potentially result in a greater good? It has always been important to me to say what I believe, to speak up for causes I feel strongly about, to call out injustice. Because I know that, and I will tweak the words of our great icon, Professor Wole Soyinka, the woman dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny. And I think I'd like to pause here to acknowledge that the great Professor Wole Soyinka is himself a wonderful example of troublesome. But it is time for us Nigerians to have a broader and more nuanced view of tyranny. The government does not have a monopoly, and a cursed monopoly it would be, on tyranny. Federal and state security forces dragging a journalist to prison, as continues to happen in this country, is tyranny. That journalist ill-treating his domestic worker is also tyranny. The disproportionate police targeting and murder of young men is tyranny. And the rape of women and girls by young men is also tyranny. Cultural norms that deny the right of property ownership to women is tyranny. It is tyranny. It is tyranny when state governments do not pay pensioners until those pensioners slump and die as broken people. The physical harassment of lawyers and some judges is tyranny. And the use of the law by the rich to subjugate the poor is also tyranny. I happen to have witnessed this firsthand in my hometown of Aba in Anambra State, where a wealthy man who will remain unnamed from a neighboring town has used the law to brutalize poor people in order to take their land. And so, in this context of a more nuanced understanding of tyranny, please permit me to tell you a personal story. About 2 years ago, I gave a press interview in which I said that the Catholic Church in Nigeria had become too much about money. Any honest-minded person knows this is true. It is flagrantly, self-evidently true in so many churches all over this country. And the point of calling this out is so that church leaders might curtail this unchristian practice, which is driving people away from attending services. Anyway, this criticism of mine appeared to upset quite a few church leaders, not all of them, because I think it is important to note that there are a few notable church leaders who are able to acknowledge the truth in constructive criticism. But it takes just one leader who is unable to take criticism to taint the perception one has of all leaders. Some months after I gave that interview, my mother died very unexpectedly. And this not long after my father had also died unexpectedly. In fact, I had by this time forgotten about that interview. But the priest in my hometown, a man called Christopher Eze, had not. And so at my mother's funeral, while my siblings and I sat in the front pew, our minds still in disbelief and our hearts broken with grief, this priest began to crudely and verbally attack me for daring to criticize the church. Later, his bishop, his superior, who apparently was also upset that I had dared to criticize the church for being materialistic, supported this priest. I spoke privately to a number of Catholics I respected about this incident, the sort of people who speak out boldly about government corruption. And I was struck by how quick all of them were to tell me, "Don't talk publicly about this. Don't go public." A friend, who is no longer a friend, who is also very outwardly religious, told me that he would take me so that we could go and beg the bishop, so that the bishop would reprimand the priest, but quietly, behind closed doors, hush, 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 for the sake of peace. But I was not asking for peace. I was asking for justice. I wanted the bishop to do the right thing, to take responsibility, to reprimand the priest in the same public way that the priest had desecrated my mother's funeral, to set a precedence for consequences, and therefore make sure that no other priest would turn what is often one of the saddest days of a person's life into a venue for settling petty scores. Anyway, that did not happen. I can tell you that as I stand here, I am still filled with a shimmering, glowering, unending rage. But why did I choose to tell you this story? Because it made me realize how often in this country we sweep aside injustice in the name of peace. But it is always a fragile and hollow peace. Because as long as we refuse to untangle the knots of injustice, real peace cannot thrive. And so in the name of peace, we say things like, okay, just leave it. Okay, it's enough now. Okay, it was very bad, but you should just stop talking about it. Okay, just manage it now, we don't do. And by saying these, we continue to make mediocrity our norm. We fail to hold leaders accountable, and we turn we fail to hold leaders accountable, and we turn what should be transparent systems into ugly, opaque cults. My experience also made me begin to think that there is something dead in us, something dead in our society, a death of self-awareness, a death of self-reflection, a death of compassion, a death of intellectual curiosity, a death of the ability for self-criticism. And I think it is time for a collective resurrection, so to speak. We cannot refuse to practice self-criticism and yet criticize the government. We cannot ignore the abuses by our religious, our traditional, our community leaders, and focus only on the abuses of political leaders. We cannot want to hide our own institutional failures while demanding transparency from government institutions. The first question we must ask is, what is the right thing to do? Not what is the materially beneficial thing to do, or what is the institutionally beneficial thing to do, but what is the right thing to do? Because if we do not do this, if we continue to sweep away injustice for the sake of a hollow peace, then we will leave behind for our children and their children an utterly bleak inheritance. The Nigerian Bar Association has shown that it is capable of boldness, of good troublesomeness, with its deeply admirable tradition of fighting the abuse of executive power. But the story is incomplete without acknowledging the things that were and are a blight to that tradition. Many, many Nigerians are disillusioned with our justice system. They believe that justice is for sale, that we can buy justice. And they have reason to believe this. They have seen the strange judgments in the courts, whether they be on election cases or commercial cases, which do not stand the test of fairness or the test of legal reasoning. Nigerians have heard of legal retainers being obtained through bribes. They have heard of contract laws used to extort money from the government. They have heard of lawyers who compromise their own clients for money. This is not common, but it does not have to be common to be something that needs to be addressed. One is too many. It is, as a friend of mine puts it, like your own doctor deliberately giving you poison. If one single doctor deliberately gives poison to a patient, that act has consequences for the entire medical profession. Nigerians are disillusioned because they know of senior members of the legal profession who act in unbefitting ways and who do not voluntarily recuse themselves when they should. Nigerians are disillusioned. It appears that many lawyers here identify with that. Bravo. Nigerians are disillusioned because they know of the decline of professionalism in some sections of the legal profession. Lawyers who will say with a very straight face, "We cannot find the records." As if records magically grow wings and fly into the sky. And linked to this lack of professionalism is also the lack of consequences. If records routinely disappear and nothing happens to those responsible, then of course, records will continue to grow wings and fly into the sky. Cleaning the tarnished parts of a system ultimately make the whole system more credible. As the Nigerian Bar Association continues to challenge the abuses of power, it is also important to turn inwards and reflect on how to avoid being co-opted into the prevailing structure of the abuse of power. It seems to me that a bold transition that feels very urgent today is that of simplifying legal procedures to make the wheels of justice run more efficiently. Legal procedures should be simpler, shorter, cheaper. We deny justice when we delay justice, and victims deserve the emotional benefits of closure as soon as possible. Technology is making everyday life more efficient. So today in Nigeria, we're streaming Nollywood films on Netflix. We're having family arguments on WhatsApp groups. And it feels like a huge anomaly to continue to rely on hastily handwritten notes in court proceedings. It is time for the full use of technology in the administration of justice. As Nigerians, many of us are familiar with what I like to call a patriotic shame, which is a shame that comes from a mix of love for our country and intense frustration at its staggeringly unfulfilled potential. Some of us have an attack of patriotic shame when we visit another country and see things as basic as people simply and quietly standing in queues. And we compare it to the unnecessary chaos of our public life. So I suffered an attack of patriotic shame recently when I visited Rwanda and spoke to Rwandan women who told me how very seriously the Rwandan justice system takes sexual assault. Not just in Kigali, the capital, but even in the rural areas. And it made me think of the ongoing struggles of many brave lawyers in this country, and I thank you all, who want to create a system that acknowledges sexual assault as the heinous crime that it is. There are still laws in our books today that deprive women of their full human rights and are relics of a bygone era. And while I am on the subject, the important subject of women, I want to say something about an even more important subject: football. The men are like, yes, that's even more important. So I understand that the NBA conference will have sports competitions, and it was announced that the winning prize for the inter-branch male football competition is 500,000 naira, while the winning prize for the female football competition is 200,000 naira. I cannot think of a better opportunity for a bold transition today. And so, I understand all the justifications. And I just want to say very quickly that the Women's Tennis Association has been a global trailblazer in this issue. And so they had to deal with the same kinds of justifications of less sponsorship availability, lower TV audiences, and therefore lower self-funding, and that sort of thing. But the US Open equalized the prize money in 1973, and then 34 years later, Wimbledon also equalized the prize money, despite all of these justifications. So, the Nigerian Bar Association, over to you. So, speaking of bold transitions, by this time next year, we will have a new president. It is essential for the future of Nigeria that the elections not only be free and fair and conducted transparently in accordance with both the letter and spirit of all the laws, but that it is seen and believed by the Nigerian people to be the case. We must believe that our voices have been heard. I know that the Nigerian Bar Association has been actively involved as an election observer, working with civil rights organizations, but your role in the upcoming elections will be critical, both in practical ways, such as you're already doing, but also legally in the court cases that inevitably follow elections in this country, although we hope that this will not be the case this time. And so I think I can speak for many Nigerians when I say that we are counting on you to act as our collective social conscience in the upcoming elections. Finally, as I conclude this keynote speech, I want to once again thank you for inviting me. I want to thank in particular, again, Mr. Olumide Akpata. I want to thank everyone who was involved in organizing this, because clearly it must have been quite a feat. I also want to thank my friend Tobinna Erojikwe, and I want to tell you a little story that I hope will embarrass Tobinna. Tobinna and I were in secondary school together, the University of Nigeria Secondary School in Nsukka, and Tobinna was known to be very intelligent. He is. I told you there's something in the water we drank in Nsukka. So I made the rather dubious choice of choosing as my boyfriend someone who was not very intelligent. And so I did not know this at the time. I learned this much later. It turned out that this person, this boyfriend of mine, who was a friend of Tobinna's, relied on Tobinna to write his love letters. I think Tobinna should take a bow. And I used to be so impressed by this boyfriend's love letters. And only years later did I learn that Tobinna actually wrote them. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you need any help with writing love letters, you know where it's at. But you have to pay him. And so, in conclusion, compassion may not be a word that we instinctively associate with the law, but compassion is intrinsically a driving force, whether explicitly stated or not, behind much of what the Nigerian Bar Association does. Compassion is one of the most powerful forces possible, and we lose a lot if we lose sight of compassion. And so, as officers in the temple of justice, compassion is necessary to avoid the desecration of the temple. I wish you well as you continue your conference, and may you all continue in your bold transitions. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please, photographers, did you get that photograph? Thank you.